Alex, congratulations.
Thank you.
How does it feel to be standing here, having just defeated the defending champion on centre court?
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over center court when a nation's biggest sporting dream starts slipping away in real time. Alex Eala felt it on the 6th of July, standing on the most famous patch of grass in tennis, 2 days after she had done something no Filipino had ever done before her. Her serve, the very shot that had carried her through 3 rounds, suddenly felt foreign in her own hand. Thousands of miles away, a country was holding its breath through a public broadcast, praying for one more miracle. What actually unraveled that afternoon wasn't nerves, and it wasn't simply a better opponent standing across the net. It was something more specific, more fixable, and more human than the final scoreline of 4-6, 6-4, 3-6 will ever tell you. To understand what happened on Monday, you have to rewind to the Saturday before it, because that is where this entire story really begins. 2 days earlier, Eala had walked out as a 4th seed's worst nightmare and beaten defending Wimbledon champion and world number 3 Iga Swiatek in a 3rd-round match that instantly became one of the most celebrated results in Philippine sporting history. She won it 7-6, 11-9, 6-2, saving 2 set points along the way before completely taking over in the 2nd set. By the time she stepped onto center court again on Monday, she wasn't an underdog anymore. She was the story of the entire championships. The numbers around her had become almost absurd. Highlights of her win over Swiatek climbed past 1.2 million views on Wimbledon's official YouTube channel, making it the most-watched clip of the entire tournament, ahead of even Serena Williams' comeback appearance against Maya Joint, which set a shade under 550,000 views. Eala's own post-match press conference pulled in nearly 580,000 views on its own. A 21-year-old who had grown up playing on a hybrid basketball and tennis court in the Philippines, ducking under a hoop every time she stepped too far back from the baseline, was now drawing some of the most decorated names the sport has ever produced. Back home, the Philippine Sports Commission threw open the doors of the PhilSports Arena in Pasig City for a free public watch party. Fans packed into the stands and spilled onto chairs arranged across the playing floor, waving small paper Philippine flags handed out at the entrance, roaring at every single point regardless of the hour. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. had already called her a true inspiration for young Filipinos after the Swiatek win, and once the Paolini match ended, he posted that her run may have finished, but the world had only begun to see what Filipinos are capable of. First Lady Liza Araneta Marcos added her own message, saying the tournament proved a Filipino belongs among the very best in the sport. Fans who had never followed tennis in their lives were suddenly learning how a tiebreak works because of one player, one superfan at the PhilSports Arena, a man known locally as Kuya Barong, for showing up to sporting events dressed in a traditional barong and salakot while waving the Philippine flag, admitted afterward that he was still learning the actual rules of tennis and its scoring system, but that didn't matter to him. He said Eala's run allowed people back home to believe in their sports heroes again, in a sport the country had never traditionally excelled in, and that watching her compete had turned Filipinos into tennis converts almost overnight. That sentiment repeated itself across the arena floor and across timelines around the world, from Filipino communities abroad pausing their own schedules to catch matches at 3 and 4 in the morning, to local tennis organizers in Manila, saying her success had handed kids on neighborhood courts a real, visible path to follow rather than just a dream. It is worth remembering exactly where that dream started. Eala left the Philippines at 13 years old to join the Rafa Nadal Academy in Spain, trading local junior tournaments for a training system built around one of the most demanding competitors the sport has ever produced. Nearly a decade of that grind is what put her in position to even be standing on center court in the first place, and it is part of why she has talked openly about sharing every milestone not just with herself, but with the version of her that once played on courts back home with no name at all. When the final ball dropped and Paolini's name went up on the scoreboard instead of hers, Eala didn't collapse in tears or storm off the court. She shaped her hands into a small heart, held it up toward a standing center court crowd that had adopted her as one of their own, and walked off with her head high. It looked, in that moment, like a coronation wearing the costume of a goodbye. But underneath the ovation was a much less comfortable truth that almost nobody wanted to say out loud while the applause was still going. The exact shot that had made her a global story 48 hours earlier had quietly become her biggest liability, and it had picked the worst possible day to fail her. Here is where the real story lives, and it isn't a flattering one. Eala did not lose to Jasmine Paolini because Paolini produced some unstoppable, career-best performance. She lost because her own serve, the shot every scouting report on her already flagged as her softest spot, picked the biggest stage of her career to completely misfire. The official match statistics tell the story plainly. Eala landed only 49 of her 88 first serves, a first serve percentage of 55.7%, well below what top players typically need to control points on grass. Paolini, by contrast, put 72 of her 102 first serves into play, a much sturdier 70.6%. That gap in reliability meant Paolini was dictating far more often from the very first shot of the rally, while Eala was repeatedly starting points from a defensive crouch. On second serve, the damage was worse. Eala won only 48.7% of her second serve points, compared to Paolini's 67%, and Eala finished the match with 3 double faults to Paolini's 1. She also saved only 5 of 9 break points she faced, a 55% rate, against Paolini's much steadier 70%. What makes those numbers sting even more is that Eala actually won a higher percentage of her first serve points than Paolini did across the match, 65.3% to 61.1%. The problem was never really the quality of the serve when it landed. The problem was how rarely it landed, and how little margin for error she had once it didn't. Every soft, short second delivery became an invitation for Paolini to step inside the baseline and take the initiative. And a former world number 4 with grass court pedigree does not need to be asked twice. This weakness had never really been a secret. Reporters covering the tournament had already been writing, even before the Paolini match, that her serve was the one obvious piece of her game that needed strengthening if she wanted to keep beating the very best players in the world. It sat there in plain sight through her entire run, a known crack in an otherwise dazzling toolkit, just waiting for the day it would matter most. The rest of the box score only reinforces how directly the serve shaped everything else. Paolini finished with 35 total winners to Eala's 22, split fairly evenly between her forehand and backhand wings, while Eala's tally leaned heavily on her ground strokes, with only a handful coming from net approaches. None of that gap is about raw shot-making ability. Eala had already proven 2 days earlier that she could out-hit one of the best ball strikers on the entire tour. It's about how many free, low-risk opportunities a shaky serve day hands to an opponent standing across the net, and how quickly those opportunities compound into a scoreline that looks far more lopsided than the actual tennis being played. And that is exactly what makes the timing so painful, because this same serve had been a genuine weapon less than 2 days earlier. So the real question isn't really about technique at all. If her mechanics didn't fundamentally change overnight, then what actually happened to her between Saturday afternoon and Monday afternoon? The answer sits in those 48 hours in between, and it is more human than any spreadsheet of statistics could ever capture. Beating Iga Swiatek wasn't just another win for Eala. It was the single biggest emotional peak of her career, detonating in front of a global audience on the most famous court in tennis, and nobody simply switches that feeling off and resets like nothing happened. Against Swiatek, Eala's serve had genuinely worked. She used its unusual rhythm and slower pace as a weapon, and Swiatek admitted afterward in her press conference that she found it tougher mentally to accept missed returns off such an unfamiliar delivery than she would against a conventional server, saying she knew exactly how slow it would arrive and still couldn't adjust to the rhythm. That serve, awkward and unorthodox as it looked, had just dismantled the defending champion. Then Monday arrived, and the same shot turned into a problem she couldn't hide from. She walked out with fresh tape wrapped around her left forearm in addition to the taping already on her thigh from earlier in the tournament, both described as preventive measures given how long her grass season had already run, stretching back through Birmingham, Queens, Bad Homburg, and the semifinal run in Berlin. The body had every reason to be tired. The mind, by her own admission afterward, was still catching up. She said managing the emotional high of a career-defining when, while turning around to compete again 2 days later, was simply part of being a professional, and that it wasn't the first time she'd had to do it. And yet, drained as she clearly was for stretches of that match, she still found a way to win the second set outright and force a deciding third. That alone tells you the talent gap between her and Paolini was never the real issue. What she hadn't yet built was the internal reset button that lets a player fully leave Saturday behind and walk out fresh on Monday. That particular skill is one that almost every great champion has needed years, not months, to develop. And waiting on the other side of the net that day was a woman who had spent an entire career learning exactly that lesson the hard way. You cannot properly tell this story without giving Jasmine Paolini her due, because experience turned out to be the quiet difference maker in this match. Paolini is 30 years old, a former world number 4, and the joint highest-ranked Italian woman in tennis history. She reached the finals of both the French Open and Wimbledon in the same season back in 2024. She knows exactly what the second week of a Grand Slam feels like from the inside, in a way a 21-year-old simply cannot yet. The irony is that Paolini walked into this tournament looking anything but dangerous. Her 2026 season had been a genuine struggle, hampered by a foot injury that disrupted her grass court preparation, and she arrived at Wimbledon having gone 12-7 for the year, with no second-week Grand Slam appearance since the French Open the previous season. She then lost the very first set of her entire campaign, 6-0, to American Robin Montgomery in the opening round. Most players crumble after a start like that. Paolini instead used it as a floor to build from, stringing together wins over Montgomery, Viktorija Golubic, and former top-5 player Maria Sakkari to arrive in the fourth round on a run of momentum nobody had predicted for her at the start of the fortnight. That composure showed up exactly when it mattered most. In the deciding third set against Eala, Paolini won a staggering 94% of her first serve points, dropped only 5 points on her own serve across the entire set, and never once faced a break point. She took 27 trips forward to the net across the match and won 18 of them, the mark of a player trusting her instincts completely under pressure. In her on-court interview afterward, she called her season a roller coaster and admitted she had battled real self-doubt before things started turning around, adding that stepping back onto center court with Roger Federer, her childhood idol, watching from the stands made the moment even more special to her. This was the same Paolini that Eala had actually beaten earlier in the year, defeating her in straight sets, 6-1, 7-6, 5, at the Dubai Tennis Championships. So this was never really a story about one player being fundamentally better than the other. This was a story about a veteran who had already been through the fire of a Grand Slam final and knew precisely how to hold her nerve, going up against a rising star who was living through the deep end of tournament tennis for the very first time. Beating Eala also meant something specific for Paolini's own place in the sport's history. With the win, she became the first Italian woman to reach multiple Wimbledon quarterfinals, and only the 5th Italian woman in the Open era to reach 3 or more Grand Slam singles quarterfinals overall, joining a list that includes Sara Errani, Flavia Pennetta, Francesca Schiavone, and Roberta Vinci. It also marked the first time since 2020 that any woman had reached a major quarterfinal after losing the opening set of the tournament by a bagel scoreline, underlining just how far Paolini had climbed back from that rough start against Montgomery. None of that history diminishes what Eala built over 2 remarkable weeks. If anything, it raises the ceiling on what her win over Swiatek actually meant, because it came against a version of Paolini who was about to prove she still had a genuine run left in her. If you want to find the exact moment this match slipped away, you need to look at the margins, because the final score badly undersells how close this contest actually was. Paolini finished with 101 total points won to Eala's 89, a gap that looks decisive on paper, but tells a much tighter story point by point. The first set had genuine tension in it. Both players held through the opening 3 games before Paolini broke in the fourth, capitalizing on a vulnerable Eala second serve, and rode that momentum to a commanding early lead. Eala clawed her way back, trimming the deficit and even carving out breakpoint chances of her own. But Paolini kept finding answers on serve and closed the set out 6-4. The second set produced the most electric passage of the entire match, serving at 3-4 down in games, Eala found herself facing triple breakpoint at 0-40, one swing away from potentially falling into a near-impossible hole. Instead, she reeled off 5 consecutive points to hold, a defiant response that swung the momentum and the crowd firmly back onto her side. She rode that surge to close out the set 6-4, leveling the match and sending center court into a genuine frenzy. The decider was where it all came apart, and it came apart on the smallest of margins. Eala held her first 3 service games of the third set, keeping pace point for point, refusing to let the disappointment of a lost first set or the emotional hangover from Saturday show on her face. But serving at 3-4, Paolini earned a break point, and Eala saved it with a bold first serve, buying herself another chance to hold and stay level. On the very next point, though, she double faulted, and followed it with a routine backhand that sailed long, handing over the break at the exact moment she could least afford it. From there, Paolini served for the match at 5-3. Eala, refusing to go quietly, fought back to love 30 with 2 gutsy, aggressive returns, briefly threatening one more twist in a match that had already produced several. But Paolini answered with an ace down the middle, her second of the afternoon, and when Eala's final forehand sailed long on match point, the contest was over after 2 hours and 22 minutes on center court. What makes that final game so difficult to watch back is how avoidable it looks in hindsight. Eala wasn't broken down by a barrage of Paolini winners in that game. She handed it over herself with a double fault and a long ground stroke, the exact kind of unforced errors that creep in when a player's legs and mind are running on fumes rather than genuine tactical breakdown. It's a pattern that shows up again and again for young players stepping into the second week of a major for the first time, and it is almost always the very last piece of the puzzle to develop, arriving only after enough of these exact situations have been lived through and survived. Across the entire afternoon, Eala converted only 3 of her 10 breakpoint opportunities. In a match this tight, those missed chances are the difference between a place in the quarterfinals and a flight home. She summed it up herself in the press room afterward, saying that at this level everything comes down to very fine details, and that in matches this close, 1 or 2 points end up deciding everything. What she may not have fully clocked in that moment is that up in the BBC commentary booth, one of the greatest players who ever picked up a racket had already spotted a tactical pattern working against her, and it had nothing to do with nerves at all. This is the part of the story that got buried under all the emotion, and it's the piece that turns this from a sad ending into something genuinely fixable. While most of the tennis world was focused on how Eala was feeling, 9-time Wimbledon champion Martina Navratilova was watching where her serves were actually landing, and she was openly puzzled by what she saw. A graphic flashed up during the second set showing that Eala, a natural left-hander, was serving out wide far more often on the deuce side and down the middle on the advantage side, the opposite pattern of what a lefty typically wants to exploit. Only about a third of her serves were sliding away as slices to the backhand. Watching from the BBC booth, Navratilova called the pattern crazy for a left-hander, pointing out that Eala simply wasn't using her natural lefty advantage nearly as much as she could, and suggested her grip was opening a touch too early to generate real slice and pace. Former British number 1 Laura Robson offered a genuine counterpoint on air, arguing that without real pace behind it, a wide serve on the advantage court would simply sit up in the strike zone and get punished by Paolini's backhand. So going out wide only makes sense if a player is willing to fully commit and accelerate through the shot. That small disagreement between 2 experts tells you this wasn't a careless mistake on Eala's part. It was a genuine tactical puzzle that even seasoned analysts didn't fully agree on. Days later, speaking on Tennis Channel, Navratilova went further, describing Eala's serve bluntly as too much of a puffball, noting that while Swiatek couldn't handle its awkward rhythm, Paolini attacked it relentlessly, and that Eala is tall enough that her serve should eventually rival or beat Paolini's. She encouraged Eala to change her grip and lean into her left-handed advantage, rather than serving to Paolini's forehand as often as she did. Former British number 1 Greg Rosetsky echoed the sentiment on his own podcast, saying the serve needs to become a genuine weapon that lets her seize the first strike in a point, adding that the accuracy and power would likely come with time. Former world number 1 Caroline Wozniacki added the emotional layer that ties the whole picture together. She pointed to the rawness of a young player still learning how to hold her nerve in the biggest moments as the real story of the deciding set, while making it clear she believes Eala's most explosive tennis and her best days as a competitor are still ahead of her rather than behind. Analyst Jim Courier, working the same broadcast, spent much of the match praising Paolini as a maximizer of her own talent, a player who consistently gets every last ounce out of what she has on a given day, which is precisely the skill Eala is still learning to build for herself under pressure. Put all of it together. A serve everyone already knew was fragile, a natural lefty advantage that wasn't being used to its fullest, a mind still catching up from the emotional high of Saturday, and a deciding set given away on the finest of margins. That is the real reason Eala didn't win Wimbledon this year, and remarkably, none of it is permanent. Strip away the disappointment and look at what she actually walked away with, because the aftermath tells a very different story than the scoreline alone. Eala collected £300,000 in prize money for her run to the fourth round and banked 240 ranking points, lifting her to a projected career-high ranking of world number 28. She became the first Filipino player in the Open era to reach the second week of a Grand Slam, surpassing the amateur-era third-round finishes of earlier Philippine greats like Felicissimo Ampon, Raimundo Darrow, and Cesar Carmona, records that had stood for more than 70 years. The way she handled the loss in front of the cameras said just as much about her ceiling as the tennis itself. There was no bitterness, no excuse-making. She spoke about focusing only on what she could actually control, sticking to her game plan, competing with bravery and a steady mind, and being able to look back without regret regardless of factors like the conditions or her opponent's level that day. She pointed to the North American hard-court swing ahead, including a first-ever appearance at the Washington Open, as the next chapter to build toward. Even the pundits urging her to fix her serve made a point of framing it as encouragement rather than criticism. Ruzetsky went as far as suggesting Wimbledon specifically could end up being the major where she eventually breaks through, comparing her competitive mold to that of her own academy mentor, Rafael Nadal. President Marcos captured the national mood simply, telling Eala that this remarkable run may have ended, but the world had only just begun to see what Filipinos are capable of. The serve can be rebuilt. The lefty placement can be recalibrated with the right grip and the right conviction. The nerves that come with backing up the biggest win of your life fade a little more every time you survive that exact situation again. The talent that took down a defending Wimbledon champion in straight sets is already real, already proven, and already hers. The only thing standing between Eala and a Grand Slam trophy is a weakness she now knows exactly how to fix. So maybe the real reason she didn't win Wimbledon this year isn't a tragedy at all. It's a to-do list, written in front of 40 million people, for a 21-year-old who now has years ahead of her to check off every single item on it. Do you think Eala rebuilds at serve and lifts a Grand Slam trophy before she turns 25? Or did Paolini expose a ceiling that will take her far longer to break through? Drop your honest take in the comments below.